All right, folks, welcome back to the podcast. Appreciate you stopping by. If you're listening on YouTube, hit that subscribe button. I appreciate that very much. Today, Naomi, welcome to the podcast. How's it going?
Thank you. Good. I'm glad to be here.
I'm very glad to have you. It's an honor. Can you briefly, for the people who might not know who you are, give us an introduction to what you do?
Sure. I work as a screenplay consultant, and then I also teach screenwriting through small group workshops. But mostly I work one-on-one with writers and writer directors or producers, anyone who has a movie idea that they're, trying to put down in screenplay form, or a screenplay that they're working on that they need some perspective on and some help sort of getting it in shape. That's where I come in.
Awesome. It's for the viewers, we this is our second time we try to record this. So it's always a bit awkward to ask the same question that you've just asked and answered, right?
That's okay. It gives me a second chance to
Yeah.
answer it.
So how did you get into all this, Naomi?
Yeah, so I moved to LA to work in entertainment about 20 years ago and started working for a producer manager. And then I went on to work at a different production company and always doing a lot of development stuff. So that's working with writers, giving notes on scripts, looking for projects that our companies would develop. And so a lot of the same things that I do now, but I was doing them under, various production companies. And then about 5 or 6 years into that, I started working with Blake Snyder, who is famously the author of Save the Cat. I started working with him on I believe it was his second or third book. I can't remember which order they go in now, but he wrote a book where he was, breaking down the structure of 50 different movies. So I helped him do the research on that. And that was sort of the bridge for me to go freelance, because it was such a crash course in screenplay structure and, watching all of those movies and breaking down the structure of them, you really kind of like absorb the rhythm of movies and stuff. And so after that, I just found like it was such a helpful tool, to actually help me analyze screenplays. And I started doing that more and more one-on-one, and just working with writers sort of on my own instead of for the production company.
Oh, that's really cool. Do you find it's very hard to, outside of work, to read something or to consume like a movie without analyzing it now?
Yes, but I always think that's a really good sign. If I watch a movie now and I forget all about the analysis of it and I'm just, engaged in the story and in the characters, that it really says something for it. So
Mm,
whenever that happens, I feel like, oh, that's a good, they've done a good job here, because
yeah.
I don't care about the structure or anything like that. I'm just so engaged with the story.
Yeah. I find for me personally, having made content on social media, it's very hard for me to consume content without going into this work mode of like analyzing, oh, maybe they could have done this differently, or maybe they did this very well. I could take that and use it to my own in my
Yeah.
own content. So it's kind of hard to turn that off, I feel like, for artists, right?
It is. I do try really hard whenever I'm reading a screenplay or watching a movie for the first time. I do try to let myself, let go of the analysis stuff, and just enjoy it and sort of absorb it. But you're right. Like when it's really good, two things. Both I get excited, and then I start trying to figure out why it's so good.
Mm,
But also hopefully it's really enthralling and I can just kind of like get lost in the story as well. So
yeah. What are some of the most common mistakes that screenwriters that you work with
Mhm.
that you find they make?
Well, it's interesting because, I've worked with so many writers now, and it's it's surprising to me how much, it doesn't matter how much experience a writer has, a lot of the things that don't work in a screenplay end up going back to the basics, right? So it's like, um, stuff like who's the protagonist? If our focus is unclear, if we don't know who to follow in the story, that's a pretty, fundamental
Mm,
thing in a screenplay. But writers of all levels sort of still, make those same, I'll call them mistakes, but I don't necessarily think they are mistakes. It's just a matter of like fine tuning the story that you're trying to tell. But yeah, the problems that a lot of writers have with trying to get their screenplays really working come back to those foundational elements. It's like,
Mm,
who's the protagonist? What are they trying to achieve? Are they actively going after it? Is there enough conflict standing in their way? Is there something at stake so we care about it? It's like those very basic things that we learn first thing when we start studying screenwriting. Um, the problems that people have, or the struggles that they have with their screenplays, tend to go back to those same things. So I feel like I'm always hitting on, the basics, like pay attention to the basics and
mm,
trying to like educate people about that. And sometimes I feel like, oh, people think I'm just saying the most, basic things, but really those are the things you need to kind of build your story on. And if you master those like foundational elements, I think that gets your screenplay like 70% of the way there. You know
mm.
what I mean? That's like so much of it.
Do you think that's an ego problem that people maybe think they're better than they are, so they jump ahead like too fast in their journey?
I don't think it's ego. I think we all do this when there's like an idea that we're excited about. We
Mm,
just get excited and
yeah.
we start thinking 4 steps ahead instead of like starting at the very bottom and kind of creating that foundation and then building on top of that. I also think those elements, just because they're foundational doesn't mean that they're necessarily easy. You know what I mean?
Mm,
And
yeah.
so sometimes it's a struggle to get your own sort of clarity on what are those basic elements of your story and how does your story work. And sometimes that takes a few drafts to get through before you're like, oh, okay, now I understand what I'm really trying to write here. And I can go back and kind of like put all of those big pieces in place in the right way so that they work together, you know?
Yeah. Something I would love some personal advice on is how to deal with writer's block.
Ooh, good question. Well, I think that probably depends on what type of writer you are. So if you're more intuitive, right? If you like to sit down and let it flow and let the muse come to you and stuff like that, I would say there's probably activities that make you feel more inspired. Sorry, I'm going to grab water really quick if
Okay,
that's
yeah, of
okay.
course. Go ahead.
um,
Stay hydrated.
yeah, so I think there's probably activities that are inspiring to you, right? I always think the things that make me feel inspired about movies are watching really good movies. So if you're
Mm,
feeling
hmm.
writer's block, I know some people say don't watch other movies because you'll end up borrowing from,
Yeah.
those stories, but I don't think that's necessarily true. I think watch things that get you excited about movies again so that your wheels start turning and you start getting those, little sparks of inspiration that you can then build on, right? And hopefully it's a
Mm,
snowball effect and that gets you going, but then you can start and keep going, right? If you're a more like technical writer, if you think about things like from the angle of a puzzle, it's very it's almost like building with Legos or something. Like
yeah.
I like to put all the pieces in place. Then I would say maybe that's the kind of situation where you'd like to talk it out with someone so that you can work through the puzzle with a sounding board, right? So if
Mm,
you're stuck, if that's the type of writer you are and you're feeling like, oh, I can't figure out this puzzle on my own, maybe it's helpful to have a sounding board and you can say, okay, here's what I'm trying to build. Here are the pieces I have. Ask me questions about it, or what do you think of this? Does this work? Is there anything that you can see here that's not working? So basically, short answer I think is I always look for activities you can do that will kind of meet you where you are as a writer, like the type of writer you are. Find things that get you over that hump, whatever that sticking point is that you are finding yourself with. Find an activity that sort of makes it fun to get past that, so it doesn't feel like you're sitting in front of the computer, slamming your head against the
mm,
keyboard just to get your story out.
yeah. What do you think about starting a new project? If you hit a writer's block, starting a new project until you feel that inspiration again for the other project?
Yeah, well, so I think that's okay. You have to get to know yourself as a writer and ask yourself if you're just jumping from project to project endlessly, right?
Mm,
Because I do think that that's a concern, especially if you are if you're in the process of learning how to write a screenplay, right? It's going to feel difficult at times. It's going to
mm,
feel challenging and uncomfortable. And I think it's very common to have that instinct of like, oh, well, this clearly isn't working. And I have this other idea that in my head, it's perfect. Like this other shiny idea that one seems so much easier and doesn't have any of the problems of this one that I'm working on. So I'm going to go work on that one instead. Right. And while I think that can keep you moving, right? So it can keep you from getting stuck on one project and never making progress. I would just be careful that that's not what you do continuously so that you never finish a project, right?
Mm,
Because, I think you learn so much from finishing your screenplay rather than just starting a bunch of screenplays.
yeah, yeah, totally makes sense. I think for me especially, I've tried a few different models of not just in writing, but for work in general, any kind of creative work. Where, for example, I would tell myself, okay, I'm going to write 1 hour every single day, or I'm going to write 4 hours once a week, or something like that. Ton of different models. For me personally, I find that forcing myself to be creative typically burns me out and leads me in a position like writer's block.
Mm-hmm. So do you have a solution that works for you? Do you have something that you
Not
go
yet.
to? Not yet.
No.
Well, you just said though that forcing yourself to be creative is not the answer. So that's where I think, okay, maybe there is a solution that's sort of the opposite of that, right? So I have worked with writers before who were like, I have writer's block. It's almost like a perpetuating cycle now, a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? Like I sit down and I know I have writer's block, so then I just have more writer's
Mm,
block.
yeah.
And so I think for that, maybe give yourself like a week where you're not going to write at all, or however long you have to devote to this exercise,
Mm,
right? 2 weeks, not writing at all. I'm not going to allow myself to write. And I bet during that time in your day to day, like when you're in the shower, when you're walking the dog or whatever, the ideas will start to come to you and you'll start to get excited about getting back to your project again,
yeah.
you know?
It's typically for me at least, I really will find a lot of excitement for a project and I'll go all in, just go crazy with it. And then I crash completely. And then I need a long time, like just away from it to find that spark of excitement back again.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think we've all been there with projects. It's like any project any screenplay I've ever worked on, there always comes a point where you just hate it. You know what I
Mm,
mean? Where you're just like, I don't like this at all anymore. I don't like anything
yeah.
about it. I don't like any of the characters. I don't like my writing, all of that. And that is challenging because it's like, how do you fall back in love with your own work, right?
Mm,
Um, and that's what I think it's about. It's like it's finding ways to rekindle that romance. So whether it's going back to what you loved about it to begin with, like whatever that spark of inspiration was originally, sometimes remembering that can make you fall in love with it again. That's why I always tell people, like, when you first get that excited idea, like write down everything you love about it and then put that away so that when you have those moments where you're like,
yeah.
this is terrible, I don't want to write this anymore, you can go back to that. And it's almost like a letter to yourself from the
Yeah.
past of like, here's everything you love about this
Yeah.
project, don't forget about those things. And that
Ah,
can get you excited again,
that's a good exercise to try. That's
Yeah.
really cool. Do you
Yeah.
think it's a good prognosis of talent that you hate what you do in a way because you're so passionate about it that you want to make it the best possible thing that it can be, and you want it to be perfect, but nothing can ever be perfect, so you end up just hating it.
Well, yeah, I think it's a good indication of taste, at least, if not
Mm,
talent, right? If you have those standards of something that you want to
yeah.
achieve with your own work, certainly you have an ability to recognize what's good and what's not good, right? And the hard part is not giving up before you get there because
Mm,
nothing starts out brilliant. I mean, well, maybe some things. Very few things though
yeah.
start out perfect or great, right? So you have to be willing to not be good in order to stick with it long enough to get good.
Yeah. Interesting. Something I love to talk to artists about is how to find that middle ground of creating what really excites you, what you really love, but also have the audience in mind. So, or the market rather. Do you find that a lot of talented people have a hard time with, if we go back to like screenplays, they have a hard time selling their screenplays, even though it could be the best screenplay in in the world, but they have a hard time selling themselves and selling the screenplay. You think that happens often?
That's an interesting question. I mean, if you look at the numbers, yeah, a lot of people have trouble selling screenplays, right?
Mm,
Because there are so many screenplays written every year, but very few movies made. And you know, there are more screenplays bought and optioned than movies made, obviously, but still, the percentage is not not really in our favor, right?
mm,
Um, so I don't know if that's necessarily a problem though of not knowing what the market wants or not knowing, sort of how to write something that an audience will like. I think that a lot of people come to screenwriting because they are such passionate audience members. You know what I mean? Like they love
yeah.
movies
They're fans
and
of it first.
yes,
Yeah.
exactly. They love it and so they want to do that for other people. They want to create those movie experiences where people fall in love with movies or get excited, for action movies or whatever it is. Um so I think it's more just the industry, the
Mm,
way the industry is just like there isn't as much content produced as there content produced for TV and film as there is, content being produced by aspiring writers.
yeah.
Um, yeah, and I think there's a whole range of reasons that people don't sell particular scripts. A lot of people try to pitch and sell screenplays that just aren't ready yet. Some of them, probably could have thought a little bit more about the concept before they wrote the script. So maybe that's just sort of a non-starter. I think there's a range of reasons. Yeah.
Mm. But do you feel like there is value to learning to sell yourself and your art?
Like learning how to pitch
Yeah.
or oh yeah, for sure. I mean, because that is always going to be if you want to make a living at your creative endeavors, right? You do
Mm,
sort of have to have that skill too of being able to talk about your work in a way that sounds authoritative and knowledgeable about what you were trying to do. That's one thing that I do see with a lot of writers who are just starting out. They may be able to write a screenplay, but a lot of times they it's almost like they haven't quite learned how they did it, if that makes sense. It's like they
mm,
they wrote a screenplay and it works, and they worked on it, and that one screenplay works well, but they're not quite able to um, understand like how did I make that work? What were the challenges that I overcame? Uh, so I think with more experience that comes being able to say like, oh yeah, I can talk about how I created more conflict in Act Two, right? Being able
mm.
to have those conversations with other people that are producers or managers or whatever that are collaborating with you on your project. Being able to have those conversations and use sort of the same language, that's a skill for sure that I think
Yeah.
helps.
Yeah, interesting. I often when I've written a couple of screenplays and often when people ask me what is it about, like I have not at all thought about like the pitching side of it. So when they ask me that, like, oh, where do I even start explaining this, right?
Yeah, well, that's where having a good log line can come in
Yeah.
handy
Mm-hmm.
because you can have that one sentence that kind of conveys the whole idea, and it can feel a little unnatural to just spew out a log line to someone when they ask what your movie is about. But hopefully, it's intriguing enough that then they'll ask you more questions and you can expand on it a little bit. And at least having that log line memorized would kind of get you over the hump of how do I describe what it's about.
Yeah. Yeah, log lines are kind of tricky. They're kind of like YouTube titles, I feel like. For example, for a podcast, like an hour-long podcast conversation, it's tricky to narrow that down to one short sentence, like that whole long conversation. And that's kind of the same thing in the log line, right? Like
Yeah.
120-page screenplay narrowed down to a one sentence.
Yeah, that's why writers find it so challenging, especially, if you've written the whole script and you know all of those details about your story and all those like intricate things that you planned and they're so beautiful on the page. It's very hard to kind of strip that back to just the basics, but that's essentially what should be in your log line, right? It's those foundational elements that we talked about. And that I just think of it as like a selling tool, right? So, I mean, ultimately, when you write the log line that you're using as a pitch, you want it to accurately convey the movie that you had in mind when you wrote that screenplay, right? So you want to give a real sense of what that screenplay will be when they read it and what that movie ultimately would be, hopefully that you have in mind. Um, and I always tell writers to go for accuracy because you don't want to give someone a log line that feels like a bait and switch. If they, you give them the log line and they're like, oh, that sounds great, and then you give them the screenplay and it's something completely different.
Yeah.
You want your log line
Hmm.
to reflect the story that you're actually telling, so that they get what they're asking for.
That's so interesting. It's so similar to YouTube, actually, like social media,
Yeah.
because, it's this exact same thing with a YouTube title. You want it to be very accurate because even though your click through rate might increase with a good title, your
Hmm.
watch time is going to decrease tremendously if the video is not about what the title was suggesting.
Yeah, yeah, it's exactly the same. And I think of it as like, selling a product. It's if you pitch someone a log line that is doesn't accurately reflect the screenplay, and they're interested in the log line, right? Then you're not doing yourself any favors, because once they read the screenplay, they're not probably going to be as interested. They thought they were getting this and instead they
Yeah.
got this. So you're really helping yourself if you can find a way to accurately sell the thing that you have. If you can
Mhm.
present the thing that you have accurately but in its best light, that's the best log line.
Do you think people might oversell their logline and not make it very accurate because they are insecure about how their screenplay is, perhaps?
Sometimes I think sometimes people write log lines that or they start the process of writing the log line, and then they feel like it doesn't sound very interesting. Like once they strip their story down to just the basics, they worry that it doesn't sound very unique or very entertaining or whatever. But I think that's a matter of finding the right phrasing rather than, throwing in different elements that you think are going to be more interesting. Because it's like you really do want to believe in the story that you wrote, right?
Mm.
It's a good test, though, before you actually write the screenplay. Can you strip it down to the basics, and is it still compelling enough? Is like, what is it that's compelling about that idea that makes you want to write it? And hopefully that's the thing that other people will find intriguing and make them want to read it.
Yeah. What are your thoughts on social media and the type of content that gets created on there?
Oh gosh.
Do you
I'm
consume
certainly
any content on social media?
I'm on social media, but I'm probably not the expert on it.
Mm.
But yeah, I mean, I think it's a really interesting um effect that it's having on people, right? Because we're so used to short form content. Even myself, I didn't grow up on social media, but now because I use it so much, I get bored with things over, over 5 minutes long. I'm like,
Mm.
I got to watch this later, or I'll watch it on,
Yeah.
two times, double speed. So I do think it's really interesting what it does to our attention spans and what
Yeah.
just what we get used to.
Yeah.
And I think you can probably see that in movies and TV shows too, right? Like you see the
Yes.
the pacing
Yeah.
change and just what kinds of things we expect to see in a given episode or in one movie.
Yeah. It's very interesting what you said that it also affected like TV and feature films. I saw this documentary, Eat the Rich.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Which I was so astonished by it because it was edited exactly like a YouTube video.
Mm.
Have you seen it?
I haven't seen it. I've just heard of it, but that's interesting.
It
Yeah. Did
yeah,
you find it effective?
I'm not sure if I actually enjoyed that. I
Hmm.
because I kind of, if I go on Netflix, I kind of expect one thing, and when I go on YouTube or social media, I expect another thing. So having these two worlds merged together, I'm not sure I really like it, to be honest.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, it's a question for, creatives too. Like as social media is, what everyone consumes all day every day, right? Like some of those techniques are going to bleed over into the style of film and TV and kind of the devices that we use and the ways that we convey information. And it's like, is that good or bad? I don't know.
Mm.
Hopefully it's effective. Have you seen any of those movies that are very deliberately like they just take place like on your computer screen, like through, you know, through chat and through video and stuff like that?
What do you mean by that?
So there's a movie, I think it was called Following, or maybe I'm getting the titles mixed up. Anyway, there are a few movies that sort of use that as a storytelling device where the entire movie is supposed to take place with like somebody watching it on their computer screen, or you know, they use like four people in a Zoom room or something as kind of the device for keeping it
Oh,
contained.
mm.
I'm just so curious if you've seen any of those and if you find them entertaining to watch.
There's a horror movie where they did that with the whole Zoom thing, I think. I haven't seen
Mhm.
it, but I remember seeing like a trailer for it. I don't think I've actually seen any movies like that. Have you?
Yeah, I know the one you're talking about, and I haven't watched it. Part of me is like, I spend all day on Zoom, so do
Yeah.
I want to watch something that makes me feel like
Oh,
I'm
yeah.
watching watching
Yeah.
Zoom? But I am curious about it, and it does, sometimes having parameters like that, like deciding we're only going to tell this story through whatever we can see through four people's, Zoom room.
Yeah.
Um, that can make interesting things happen, right? Like creative solutions come from parameters like that. So
Mhm.
I'm curious about it, but I haven't made the time to watch it yet.
Yeah, I haven't seen anything like that either, but yeah, very interesting. Maybe I should give it a go. Watch something like that. That's very interesting. It's kind of it's not similar, but in a way like a different technique like the Blair Witch Project where
Hmm.
it's filmed through a handheld camera.
Yeah, which was super innovative for they were maybe the first to have done that, and then it kind of became a trend that other people were able to use that.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
That's very interesting. Going back to writing,
sure.
this is something I've thought about quite often. What do you think it is about writing that is so appealing to people? Because I find that very successful people as well, like people who might be successful in business, something completely different, uh, always end up writing a book. Whether it be fiction, nonfiction, there's something about writing that's very appealing to human beings.
Yeah, well, I think we're all trying to be heard, right? I mean, everyone, even if you're shy, even if you think you have nothing to say, like the human in you wants to connect with other people, and that
Mm,
involves feeling heard and feeling seen, right? So I think that there is an instinct to express ourselves in some way so that we can find that connection with other people. I mean, I think that's what's at the base of it, but I'm sure there's lots of other motivations. Some people, want to feel validated. Some people want to share their knowledge and influence people in a certain way or whatever. But I think at the very core of it, it's about connecting with other people, and that's kind of the human condition.
yeah. It's very interesting. I think it's because it's communication at its core, right? I think human beings are the only animals that communicate in this way, as far as I'm aware, at least. But it goes back to the hunter gatherers days with cave paintings, even some sort of communication that you leave a part of yourself on something different than yourself, if that makes any
Mhm.
sense.
Yeah, it does. It makes a lot of sense. I think you're right. There's something about, it's not just legacy, but it's like having had an impact on, the world or your immediate world, however big or small that is, knowing that you made some impact or some difference on something, right? I mean, I
Mm,
think that that's a pretty basic human instinct as well, right? Like we want to know that we made, there was a purpose in being here, right?
yeah.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that a lot of people are drawn to writing, if we look beyond that kind of basic human element of it, creatively, a lot of people are drawn to writing because it seems easier than it is. You know
Mm,
what I mean?
yeah.
We're all fans of stories. We all love stories, and we all, love consuming stories in one way or another, whether it's movies or novels or, plays or whatever. And I think that passion for it, makes us want to be able to do it as well. And then writing is something we all learn how to do as kids. So it's like, oh,
Yeah.
well, I love this and I know how to do this. So can I
Yeah.
put them together and create my own? And there's like a whole, there's a whole middle ground there of learning and mastering the craft and being able to sort of tell a good story. It's not just about writing down a bunch of events. It's finding a way to tell the story in a way that's compelling and intrigues people and moves people's emotions. And that's like a whole journey, of course.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, absolutely. Do you think that this, I don't know why I just thought of this. Do you think something in the writing gets lost now that we move everything digitally so that we don't write in our hands anymore?
probably, I think there are probably some things that get lost. I notice, and this is probably just the old lady in me, right? But I notice when people use sort of like text shorthand in their writing,
Mm.
in their creative writing, I get a little bit like, oh, come on, you can
Yeah.
spell that
Yeah.
out. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But we're just also used to it now of like using shortened words or, little phrases that we use on social media. Um, so you know, I don't know if it's necessarily there's something being lost as it's just evolving, right? And
Mm.
it's changing and maybe there are elements of it that are going away or being used less frequently, but we're getting new versions of it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's definitely evolving. Like, I don't think anyone from my generation knows how to write. What's it called? Cursive?
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 Oh
Yeah.
no.
Like, I can't even read that. If my grandma writes a letter to me in cursive,
Oh
I
wow.
can't read that.
That's really funny.
Yeah.
Yeah. So when you write longhand, do you print?
Uh, what do you mean print?
I mean, so you don't write cursive, so you just write out each letter
Yeah,
separately.
exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's definitely a shift in
Yeah.
in writing, in handwriting for sure. I always say that the most useful class I ever took in school was typing. Like learning
Mm.
how to touch type without
Yeah.
looking at the keyboard.
Yeah.
That's the thing that I use most in my life.
Yeah.
So,
It is interesting how that evolves. I mean, at some point, I don't think anyone's actually going to actually write with a pen.
mm,
And as a matter of fact, in the future, like maybe in 50 or 100 years, very scary enough, I don't think anyone's going to write, period. Because once we get brain implants and we can
yeah.
read each other's minds, I mean, probably writing will get lost completely.
Yeah, but I mean, I guess it's how you define writing, right? I mean, isn't it just putting your thoughts and putting your words out into the world on on paper or digitally on your screen,
Mm,
right? So even if you're not typing out your words, like, do you ever dictate stuff? Do you ever like speak it and then have it or like
not often.
transcripts
No,
from your
not so
videos?
often.
Well, if you have transcripts from your videos, would you consider that writing?
No, I don't
No?
think so.
Okay,
I
fair.
mean,
That's fair.
would you?
I mean, I would consider it your thoughts, and if they come out in written form, maybe I'd consider it writing if you went through and did an edit. If you
Yeah.
went, if you actually touched it with your fingers, if you touched the
Mm,
words. Yeah, I guess you're right though. That's probably not writing. So that's not the way. That's where we're going in the future, is people won't be writing anymore. Oh, how
yeah.
sad.
Because even for, the when I edit my podcast clips, the shorts, there's captions and it's AI making the transcript and actually writing the words for me.
Right. Right.
So, yeah, it's a very interesting question actually. Is that writing or is it not?
Yeah, because it's still your thoughts. It's not the
Yeah.
AI generating the ideas. It's just the AI generating the written form of it,
Yeah.
right? So, I mean, the content is still coming out of your brain,
Mm.
which I still think is kind of writing in some ways, but I guess it's not. I don't know.
Yeah.
It's a gray area.
It's very interesting to see where the future is going with that for sure.
True. Yeah.
What are some of your favorite movies?
Oh gosh, I there are some that I just go back to all the time because I use them a lot as teaching examples, and I'm sure people are sick of hearing about them, but The Silence of the Lambs I just think is a classic that I can watch anytime, and it's such a well put together story. So I
Is
turned it.
Sorry,
What's that?
is that the one with the cover with the butterfly over the mouth?
Yes.
Yes,
Yeah.
I haven't actually seen it, but what is it about?
It's about a FBI trainee who is tracking down a serial killer with the help of another serial killer. It's a classic. You should definitely watch it
Okay, yeah.
if you like
Hmm.
horror movies.
Yeah, I do.
And recently, Everything Everywhere All at Once is one of my new favorites. I think that goes on the top 10 list of favorite movies. Have you seen that one?
No, I haven't
What?
either. What is it
What?
called again?
Everything Everywhere All at Once.
No, I
It
haven't seen it.
it just won the Oscar. You have to
Oh, I have to see that then.
you have to see it. I
Okay.
recommend it to everyone, which is hard because it has some content in it that's a little bit questionable. It's definitely not a kid movie. You
Okay.
can't recommend it to little kids. But it's such a moving story, kind of wrapped up in this sci-fi action, genre stuff. So I recommend
Ah,
it. I think it's
cool.
great. Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah.
What are some of
So
your favorite movies?
I can't not say Lord of the Rings, the trilogy. I think those were some of the first movies I ever saw when I
Mhm.
was probably 6, 7, or 8 years old, and those left just such a big impact on me. And I don't
Yeah.
think I will ever watch any movies ever that will be better than those, in my opinion, at least.
Nice.
The storytelling, the visuals, it's just insane, amazing.
Yeah.
I love
Yeah.
Jurassic Park, Harry Potter. I really like fantasy because that was very ingrained in me from a very young age.
Yeah. That's awesome. Yeah.
So yeah, I find myself when I do screenplays, that's the stuff I like to write as well.
Yeah, and when you get stuck, when you feel like you have writer's block, go back and watch those movies because
Yes.
that kind of makes you fall in love with movies as a whole.
Do you did some of the movies you watched from an early age, do you think those impacted you to write the stuff that you like to write?
Well, it's interesting because I came to movies really late. My family did not watch movies together when I was a kid. So we read a lot. It was a very if you're reading, that was considered good. You could read
Okay.
anything you wanted in my house. So I read stuff that I do think impacted the stories that I like and probably, I really like horror movies and thrillers and sort of darker stuff like that. Not exclusively, but I do have a fondness for it. I can kind of watch a horror movie anytime.
Mm.
Um, and I read a lot of Stephen King as a kid.
Oh
So I
yeah.
do think that kind of primed me to like that scared feeling. But also, he does great character work too. He
Mm.
really gets into kind of the thoughts and the motivations of his characters, and so I think that primed me to be interested in what why people do the things they do, what motivates them, what instincts they have, that sort of thing. But some of the first movies that I remember watching and really being amazed by, the Usual Suspects was one of the first ones that I remember watching and just being like, "Wow, that you can do that in a movie?" Because it surprised me so
Yeah.
much. And I think The Sixth Sense also for that same reason, where I watched the whole thing and I was like, "What? How did
Mm.
that happen?"
Yeah.
So I remember those two movies making a big impression on me.
Ah, that's really cool. Interesting what you said that reading was considered good, no matter what you read. That's I think a lot of kids are taught that, which is kind of interesting because it doesn't matter if you write or read fiction or nonfiction, but it's just good to read.
Mhm.
Do you think in general that is true? That just reading anything, just training your brain to read is good?
Well, I do, but that could be an outdated, way to look at it. I haven't really thought about it, but there are some studies, I believe, and I can't quote you any specifically, but that reading fiction for kids, it helps them grow their empathy muscle.
Oh,
Basically, it
interesting.
helps them,
Okay.
because if you're reading fiction, you are getting into the minds of other characters and sort of considering what it would be like to
Ah.
be that person and to go through those experiences. And so I have heard that, they've studied this and it turns out that kids who read actually become or learn how to be empathetic maybe more so than kids who aren't put in that situation. So I think it's good for that reason, if nothing else.
Yeah. Ah, that's very interesting. I've never heard or thought about that.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's a difference between I think watching movies or watching TV and reading.
Mm.
Reading puts you into the mind of a particular character in a way that movies and TV really don't.
Yeah.
And it makes you kind of it really makes you see the events and the story through that character's eyes,
Mhm.
even like at an even closer perspective
Yeah.
than movies and TV can,
Makes total sense.
Yeah.
Makes total sense. I think from if we talk nonfiction, like trying to learn things
Mhm.
for me, and I think especially for men, I
Mhm.
think it's hard to read and sit still in those young years in school. I
Yeah.
think there are probably better ways to learn, in my opinion,
Oh, for
than
sure.
reading, listening, like audiobooks or even watching YouTube videos. You know, you can learn everything nowadays on YouTube, right?
Yeah, and I even even though I did like to read to learn in school, there's that I know that that's challenging for a lot of people, and even for myself who, I love to read, but when you're really trying to learn a new subject, reading might not be the best or easiest way for everyone to learn it. I listen to a lot of nonfiction audiobooks now
Yeah.
too, partly for the time for the because I'm like multitasking,
Mm-hmm.
um but also I think hearing people discuss something in conversation makes it easier to pick up new information than just reading, kind of like a
Mm.
litany of facts, right? So
Yeah.
I definitely think there are other ways, and it's nice that we have so much information available in so many different formats
Yeah.
now, so you can learn new things without having to just read about them.
Yeah. Yeah, even our conversation right here, I mean, hopefully people will take something and learn something from what you've said. Maybe not from what I've said, but
Stop.
Naomi, thank you so much for coming on. This was a real pleasure to talk to you.
Likewise, thank you for having me. It was lovely to talk to you.
Let everybody know where they can find your work.
All of my social medias. No. So you can, the best way to get in touch with me is on my website. It's writeandco.com, WRITEANDCO. It's a terrible company name, but it was the first one that I had. So that's the best way to get in touch with me and find out about my work. But you can also find me on, Twitter and Instagram and all those other things too. So
Awesome. Again, thank you so much. This was an honor.
likewise, yeah.
And thank you to the viewers for tuning in. Appreciate it. Hit that subscribe button if you have not already. Appreciate it. Take it easy. Peace.